Hello and welcome to another video in our ADHD series. You can find other videos about this subject linked below. Today, we're going to discuss the diagnosis of ADHD in adults and why the diagnosis is so complex. Recently, there has been a growing interest in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, in adults, as demonstrated by an increase in research in recent years. Studies have shown that the disorder persists into adulthood in a large number of individuals, causing significant impairment. Although ADHD was described more than a century ago, scientific studies gained strength from the 1960s onwards, as did all medical issues related to brain functioning. In the beginning, ADHD was attributed to childhood dysfunction. Therefore, over the years, scientific research has focused on this population. However, in recent years, many studies on ADHD have focused on the adult population. The adult form of the disorder was recognized as valid later. Therefore, most of the knowledge about this diagnosis was developed from studies with children and adolescents. Some researchers and clinicians still support the idea that this diagnosis is extremely rare among adults and suggest that remission of symptoms occurs in most cases. However, much of the variation in the findings on the persistence of ADHD in adults is due to the different definitions used for the concept of persistence. To diagnose kids and teenagers, some of the symptoms must be present since before 7 years of age. Unlike the assessment of ADHD in young people, in which reports from parents and teachers are of paramount importance, assessment in adults is primarily based on self-report. There are some doubts as to the reliability of self-report of ADHD symptoms, especially for past symptoms, such as those required for diagnosis, due to biases in retrieving information over time, memory impairment, and lack of critical judgment. The diagnosis of ADHD in adults presents several controversies inherent to the description of the symptoms of the disorder in this range. Although they have been researched and validated in children, the symptoms described by the American Psychiatric Association are inappropriate for adults. There are still no definitive answers for assessing symptoms of ADHD in adults. The main questions still need more studies to be answered. However, some research has already pointed to the need for a more adequate description of the clinical picture of ADHD in adults, as well as a more accurate assessment of the best cutoff point used. But how does ADHD affect adults? Well, adults with ADHD are more likely to have unstable affective relationships with a high number of divorces and separations, and professionally, they may have high difficulty or inability to comply with a routine, income below its real potential, carelessness, and forgetfulness. Adults with ADHD have a harder time staying on a long-term project, so it becomes uninteresting for them. It is known that about more than half of children with ADHD continue with the symptoms of the disorder into adulthood. In this population, the rate of family aggregation, parents and/or children who also have the disorder, is higher than in those who go into remission. Studies show that 4.4% of adults worldwide have ADHD with full symptoms. In terms of gender, contrary to clinical reports of ADHD in children, the male-female ratio of ADHD is 1:1. As of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, the DSM-5, the diagnosis of ADHD in adults now requires 5 symptoms of inattention and/or hyperactivity/impulsivity, and no longer 6 as in the DSM-4, despite evidence pointing to a cutoff of 4 symptoms in adults as appropriate. Until the 2000s, the diagnosis in adults could be made in the presence of 6 of 9 symptoms of inattention and/or 6 of 9 symptoms of hyperactivity or impulsivity. Symptoms should start before the age of 7 and cause marked damage in 2 or more areas of the individual's life, such as at home and in school. However, several problems in the operationalization of the criteria should be observed. First, the need for symptom onset before age 7 years did not seem adequate, since empirical data pointed to the possibility of symptom onset up to age 12 years. The presence of 6 symptoms per dimension did not take into account studies that pointed to a decline in the intensity and number of symptoms over time, and the description of symptomatology was more appropriate to be used to diagnose children. From the DSM-5 onwards, the diagnosis of ADHD in adults began to require 5 symptoms of inattention and/or hyperactivity or impulsivity, and not 6, more as in the DSM-4, despite evidence pointing to a cutoff of 4 symptoms in adults as adequate. When it comes to how ADHD affects adults, there are a series of behaviors that can be attributed to the disorder. Adults with ADHD may be impulsive when speaking, or embarrassed to think and express themselves clearly. A lot is going on in their head, which causes some difficulty in organizing thoughts coherently. The triple golden symptoms, inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, is also present in adults, although it presents themselves differently. In most adults, inattention is predominant over hyperactivity. Most adults eventually develop compensatory strategies to deal with their deficits and the damage they cause, especially adults who have a higher IQ, stable socioeconomic status, and/or other resilience factors. As adults in general have more autonomy than children, being able to choose activities of their own, it is common for them to report difficulty focusing on specific situations or environments and not on everything. Inattention, in both adults and children, is a symptom and not the cause, as it may seem. The impairment of target executive functions is at the heart of the problem, affecting attention, but not just attention. This impairment affects the ability to plan and execute tasks, organization, time management, working memory, emotion regulation, task initiation, and target persistence. In adults, this impairment often appears as difficulty completing tasks on time, frequent delays, forgetting planned tasks, and such. Unfortunately, this set of difficulties is usually judged by coworkers and/or close family members as laziness and carelessness. This perception makes adults with undiagnosed ADHD see such difficulties as part of their personality, inhibiting the search for a diagnostic evaluation and causing serious problems in self-esteem and self-confidence. Hyperactivity in adults is described as difficulty in remaining still, commonly in specific situations. This difficulty often affects sleep and activities that require them to be still for long periods, especially if such activities are must-do or something that doesn't interest them at all. It is worth mentioning that both children and adults with ADHD can spend hours focused on the same thing if this thing is pleasurable, stimulating, and/or full of novelties. It is essential to understand that this is not a free and frivolous choice. People with ADHD have a brain chemistry deficiency. When they are faced with pleasurable, stimulating, and novelty things or activities, this brain circuitry is activated. In other words, constant pleasure and stimulation increase chemical production in the brain of those with ADHD, compensating for the deficiencies. As stated earlier, there are adults with ADHD who have not had a diagnosis and who, however, have a well-developed life. They complete their university courses, develop solid careers and marriages, have children, and have stable financial quality. These adults were able to develop strategies to compensate for their difficulties, but it is worth remembering that this ability to overcome their ADHD with compensation strategies comes from resilience factors. Still, it is common for such adults to report feeling short of what they could. Some articles agree that the late-onset adult ADHD may be a valid diagnosis, and support that proper treatment from clinicians should not be neglected in adults because of the age of onset criterion. However, there is still a lot of controversy among researchers and practitioners. What about you? Do you suspect that you might have ADHD? Does your family have a story of ADHD? What brought you to this video? Let me know in the comments, and I'm sure I'll see you in another video.